Welcome to Common Ground with Bill Walton, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
I'm here today with my friend and frequent guest, John Tamny, who's a brilliant and bold political economist. And John and I were talking about ideas for my startup podcast, and he had a pretty interesting one that I thought we might go with. And the idea is John interviews me. John?
Thank you very much, Bill. The idea basically with this is that while people can sit across from Bill and talk about policy, true learning and understanding of policy has to come from talking to people who actually live in the real world, who are working in the real world, allocating capital in a world of policy mistakes and also successes. And so the idea in today's podcast is to talk to someone who is in the arena, as it were, and Bill Walton has been in the arena to a T over the years. Let's go over his resume, however briefly. He is the founder and chairman of Rappahannock Ventures, a private equity firm, and also Rush River Entertainment, a feature film production company behind The Price of Desire, The Ticket, and Max Rose. He was the chairman of the investment banking firm Allied Capital for 12 years. Prior to that, he worked for Butler Capital Corporation, the merger and acquisition group of Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, and Continental Illinois Bank. He served in the Army before that, working in the Pentagon, and went to Indiana University, both undergrad and for graduate school. This is someone from whom all of us can learn a lot, and I'm excited about what's about to take place. And so I will begin with a more basic question. In creating Common Ground, what was the impetus for it, and what were there some past influences that have shaped the show as it is today?
Well, the idea behind this is I've been very fortunate to have come across a lot of very, very smart and talented and successful people in the course of my career. I also, as you can, maybe more in my background, I've also been involved in the arts and in education, and so also outside of finance. And I've got a wide range of interests. And unlike you, I don't really have the temperament to sit down and crank out a book every year or two. And yours are quite good, and I admire you for that. But I thought a more interesting, for me anyway, choice of a forum to communicate ideas would be a podcast, where we could bring in people a couple times a week, maybe two people per show to talk about something. And instead of what we see in the cable channels where people talk about something for 30 seconds or less, or maybe they get a whole minute to talk about something, and then very often they're cast where somebody in the opposition side is there, and you basically see two people yelling at each other. I thought there might be an interest in a long-form show, say 45, 60 minutes, where we could dig into topics in depth. Technology is changing a lot now with podcasting. We've got the iPhone, we've got all the different tablets that are out there. People are spending time in the car listening to these things, and I think it's a big and growing field.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely ahead of things, and I think it's important simply because there isn't enough of this discussion. As someone who's on cable TV a lot, you don't get the chance to offer up big ideas. So Uncommon Ground is a very important show that I think is going to influence the debate a lot.
Well, and also, we're America's highly polarized now, and we've got red meat, hot button language on both sides. There's a lot in the internet, I think, that's caused that to be exacerbated. But I think the name Common Ground comes from seeing if we can't tease out solutions or understand problems in a way without necessarily barking at each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a long path before getting to On Common Ground, and I want to jump around a little. And I think it would be interesting, first and foremost, to begin with someone who was legendarily charismatic, specifically William S. Paley, the founder of Columbia Broadcast System. Everyone knows that as CBS. What was he like? What was it like to work for him? What did you learn from him?
Well, William Paley was born in 1899, and he came from a family that had been very successful in the cigar business. And he he grew up in the cigar business, traveling to Amsterdam every year with his family, buying cigar tobacco for their cigars. But he didn't really have the temperament to be a tobacco trader or a cigar maker, and had a taste for the high life. And in the 1920s, his family said, "Well, we have to do something with Billy. Billy's really not well suited for the cigar business." And this new thing called radio was coming along, and he had a natural flair for music and film and acting, and film in those days was silent. And then they found a radio station, or he worked on it, and then created this idea of a radio network, which in the 30s and 40s, by the 40s, it became a TV network. And I think the thing that most impressed me with him was he had just incredible charm when he wanted to. He could also be very tough when he wanted to. And he loved the stars in the business. I mean, he had the famous Paley raids in the 30s, I believe, or maybe it was the 40s, where NBC, the rival to his CBS at the time, had all the big stars. And over the course of 90 days, he somehow convinced most of them to come over to CBS. And so he had a great love for the talent, love for the actors, love for the medium. And he could be blindingly quick when it came to certain things. His cigar business background showed in everything he did. When I was working with him, we had he of course had a private jet, and he wanted, as his investment guy, he asked me to figure out whether we could find somebody to manage it. And we found somebody I thought was quite good, and he brought him in, and we talked for about an hour, and I thought it was a very pleasant conversation about destinations and how the plane was going to be managed. And the young man left the room, and Bill Paley said to me, "This guy's making all his money in gasoline." That's where his margin is. So he was this combination of showman and penny-wise businessman. And I don't think you see many people having that talent combined in one human being.
Hugely perceptive. Did he ever tell you he had regrets business-wise that were obvious ones in retrospect? Or
no, Bill Paley didn't really share regrets.
I like it. I like it.
He was, but he was a very kind in offering advice. I mean, I was much younger than he was when I went to work for him, and he was almost fatherly, which was unusual. Now, if I'd been president of CBS, and he was the chairman, the presidents of CBS didn't last too long because he liked being in charge, but I wasn't. I was an investment guy. We had a great relationship.
Mm-hmm. Now, before Paley, going back in time somewhat, you were in the Army, specifically in the Pentagon, and so you saw, I assume, a lot up close. What did you learn from this that made you think this is not what I will do in running a business? And did you learn some good things too?
The Pentagon, I think the largest office building in the world in terms of square feet. I think it's a daunting place to be in because you walk for miles and miles in these corridors. I think I learned that I didn't want to be a career bureaucrat. That was part of the answer because, for example, I had a job in the Adjutant General's office, and it was an interesting job. I was the enlisted clerk in charge of the Army's investigation into the My Lai incident. Mm-hmm. And as such, they were having trials at the time, and I was the person responsible for seeing that certain kind of documents that lawyers had requested could get to them, and I was sort of the librarian for the investigation. But I was housed in the same office as the declassification clerks for the Army. And at the time, this was 1973, they were working on declassifying documents from 1914, and so they were bureaucrats living, 50 years earlier, figuring out whether something was still sensitive information. I thought, gee, that may be great for some people, but not me, not for me.
And so being in this position cured you of the desire, plainly, to work in government.
It did, and many other things cured me of that desire.
Well, so out of business school, your first stop was Continental Bank, a very famous bank. It's something that the books have been written about. What was the atmosphere like? What did you learn? And I'd love to hear specifically How has the face of banking changed today in your estimation relative to what you experienced back then?
Well, I think the banking business has changed enormously. At the time I was there, it was in the mid 70s, early 80s. It was still pretty much the banking business that had been since the Depression. And there was a saying about bankers that the banking business was such that you lent money at 2%, or you borrowed money at 2%, you lent money at 5%, and you were on the golf course at 3. It was the 3-5 or 2-5-3 rule. And so banking was not exactly a go-go business, but nor did I think it should be. But it was very different in the sense, say, from today, in that you knew all the borrowers and you knew all the customers who were depositing money. It was a very personal business, and we made loans to people we knew, and consequently, I think we took better risks because we could assess not just the numbers, but also the human being that was going to be the borrower.
Mm-hmm. Did you learn right then? Was that precisely because it was a 2-5-3? Was your feeling then that that's not what you wanted to be, and was it rewarding your talents not enough? Or
well, I guess I could be accused of being an ambitious young man, and it was a pretty sleepy business, and I felt I wanted to be more in an entrepreneurial world, and I was eager to get to Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd gone to Indiana, which is a Big Ten school, and Wall Street in the mid '70s didn't recruit. Well, it really didn't recruit much out of the Ivy Leagues or out of the out of the families that own the small investment banks. And so I viewed the Continental Bank as something that you decide to do in a career move where you say, "Gee, I'll start out here, mm-hmm. and I'll try to do well, and I'm going to learn the skills of lending. I'm going to learn the skills of assessing entrepreneurs' characters and borrowing, and learn basically the commercial world, which mm-hmm. I didn't know that much about coming straight out of business school. And I learned a lot of that. And I think the things I learned at Continental, though, enabled me to get a job at Lehman Brothers cum laude after about 5 years at the bank, and that was where I wanted to be anyway. So it took me a little while to get there, but I got there.
So you would say that the time at Continental it made you a better investment banker?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I think the thing you see in banking, particularly banking I was doing, I was asked to go to New York to work in the derivatives group. I don't think they called it that at the time, but highly technical finance. And instead, I was more interested in entrepreneurs. And so I said, I want to go to the Steels and Wheels group in Chicago. And the Steels and Wheels group was the customers were automobile dealers and people who owned steel service centers, warehouses for steel. And they're all owner operated, and they were all mostly started by somebody or somebody's parent or things of that. And I got to know them all very well in terms of how they ran their businesses day to day, and got to assess in that process, who's a good businessman in terms of allocating capital, who's good in terms of marketing. I think the experience was invaluable. But it was a very personal human experience, and I became friends with a lot of my borrowers.
Mm-hmm. Now, I always tell people that Lehman Brothers, particularly when you were there, it was 81 to 84.
Yeah, it was Lehman Brothers cum laude, but still a private partnership.
Mm-hmm. And it was Goldman Sachs before Goldman Sachs was Goldman Sachs. I always try to point out to people that Tom Hill was there, Pete Peterson. Some of the best investment bankers ever were in New York, where you were at the time. What was your thought on them? Was it a huge learning experience working for them? What were they? What did they teach you?
Well, Steve Schwarzman was also there.
Also, yes,
he was in the M&A group, and Eric Gleacher, and we had a lot of people that went off to set up even greater firms. Although Lehman Brothers cum laude was just one of the best firms when I was there. It got sold in 1984. What did I learn? I think one of the most interesting things I learned as pertains to the crisis we just went through in 2008, 2009 was that I was there. It was a private partnership. There may be 50 partners, and they were all required to leave their capital in the firm. So you get paid you get paid a small salary, maybe you get a big bonus at the end of the year, but that bonus went to buy preferred stock, which stayed in the firm. And we had two cultures in the firm. We had an investment banking culture, which was sort of working with clients and taking companies public or raising capital. And then we had a trading culture. And the risks in the trading culture are pretty obvious. You make a bet, either long or short, on something like that, and if it works, you make money. If it doesn't, you can lose everything. And so there's a lot of risks, and you've got to hedge your risk, and you've got to do it properly. In the investment banking side, it's more reputation risk. It's more who you choose as a client. And this is where sort of the background I had at Continental Bank was helpful in assessing, character of potential clients. But the culture was such that the traders were worried that the investment bankers were going to take on clients that weren't worthy of the firm's brand. And the investment banker side were afraid the traders were going to make bets that they didn't think they should make. And so the partners would get the balance sheet of the firm every day. Mm-hmm. And I remember the partner I worked for, I got to be senior vice president. I was one level below partner, and he would get that balance sheet, and he would look at it, and he would make sure that the trading positions were there. And I think on the trading side, they're doing a lot of the same things. They'd get the client list about who we were thinking of bringing in as a client. So because everybody had their own money in the firm, our leverage was like 5 to 1, from $5 of debt to maybe $1 of equity, something like that. There just weren't any big risk taken. And consequently, it was a much more stable business. At the time I was there were probably, in 1960, there were probably 200 or 300 small investment banks raising capital for people, putting together mergers and things like that. But then what happened in the 80s, about the time I was there, they figured out how to raise public capital. And when they brought in the public capital, the argument was we can do more business, we can be in more businesses, we can grow bigger, faster, make more money. And that's true. Mm-hmm. But what happened was they no longer had their own money in the firm. And so I think you saw what the big word for it is agency risks, where you had people in the firm running the firm that didn't really have all of their capital tied up in it. Mm-hmm. Now, they still had a lot, and I think a lot of the investment bankers went through a lot of pain in 2008, 2009, because they still had a lot of funds in, but they had an awful lot that wasn't in the firm. And I think that's a cultural difference between then and now. And it was also the cultural difference between going from a commercial banking to investment banking when you had private partners. The commercial banking culture, you're really working in an institution, and so the incentives and motives were different.
Mm-hmm. What's your response? To me, investment banking is one of the most important but also least understood professions in the world. I always say it's one thing to come up with a business idea. It's one thing to come up with an expansion idea. It's quite another to find capital. Investment bankers are paid well precisely because they can do what few can do. Mm-hmm. What's your response when you read in the Wall Street Journal about easy money and easy credit? Do you take that seriously?
I don't think anything's easy. You mean easy money as in as what? You mean what the Federal Reserve is doing, or
journalists would give the impression that somehow it's easy out there, and it's easy for businesses to raise money. And I would guess that someone in your position who's seen this over the years, that in fact it's very difficult to do.
Well, you and I talked about this during your show on, I think we talked about your idea of credit. Mm-hmm. And credit's something that you have as a borrower. It's not something a lender or an investment banker gives you. And yeah, it's pretty easy to raise money if you're Apple. Yeah. Or if you're Microsoft, or if you're Google. I suppose if you want to raise money, that's easy to do. So you've got a franchise like that, capital's abundant. But for most companies and most startups, they're not in that mode. And mm-hmm. so raising capital is difficult, time-consuming, and the banker, if doing a good job, is the person that can put the company that they think has some promise together with the investors who would be interested in that. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's easy. I think many, as I used to say when we were, I managed a lot of investment professionals, and a lot of people wanted to be in the business, but it's mm-hmm. extremely complicated. You've got to do a lot of a lot of hard analysis and have to be pretty good at math and pretty good at negotiation, and it's not something everybody can do.
Mm-hmm. I just don't think it's talked about enough how difficult this is, and I hate the perception that's been created. Now, thinking about you ultimately moved on into your own investment banking shop. What made you do that? Was that a scary thing?
Well, my resume is such that I tend to do something, and then I think I've achieved mastery. I want to try to move on to something that's maybe a little tougher, a little newer, maybe a little bigger challenge. And I found myself in the late 80s working at a private equity firm, Butler Capital, started and run by Gil Butler, who's an investment genius. And our business then was investing money in private companies as a private equity investor. And one of the things that struck me was one of the companies that we invested in was called Silvestri and run by a really neat entrepreneur named Steve Berkowitz. And everybody's always talking about, Steve, he's great, he's a triple threat, he can manage people, he can do numbers, and he can market. And at that time, I was thinking I wanted to move out of investment banking into something where I was running something. Mm-hmm. And since I had no background in running something particularly, I wasn't exactly an obvious hire. So I thought, well, gee, I think I could do what Steve does. And so I went out and set up my own little boutique called Walton Kennedy. And, I've sort of been working for myself in many ways ever since. Mm-hmm. But I had to do it on my own. It was. I didn't think in your world. I don't think I had the street cred or the credit to go to somebody and say, "Let me run your company." I decided, well, I maybe need to just start one of my own and see how it goes.
What were the early days like? Did you find yourself sometimes regretting it, or was it something you took to right away?
I never regretted it, but it wasn't easy. We started the private equity firm in 1991, 92, I think, and it was right in the middle of one of the famous recessions we have where you couldn't get anything financed. Mm-hmm. And I had a couple deals that were close to closing, and they didn't happen because of one thing, financing fell through, the entrepreneur changed their mind. It was always difficult, but I always enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. One of the most important things I ever heard was from a former very successful trader in the Chicago Merc, and he made the point that if you're good at this business, you'll be wrong 51% of the time. If you're great, just about every one of your trading ideas will be incorrect, but you'll get more right than you'll get wrong.
Right.
Venture capital, I've heard that the batting average for failure is about 900. Where is it in private equity? We're talking about a very difficult business, correct?
I think the batting average in private equity is higher because you're betting more on established companies and you're analyzing cash flow and you're looking at markets that already exist and products that already have customer acceptance of some type, and companies have typically been around for several years, maybe sometimes a lot more. Mm-hmm. Venture capital, it's more an idea, concept, an entrepreneur, and the trade there, though, is that the venture capital, when it works, the returns can be exponentially higher, 100 times, 1,000 times higher than in a home run private equity deal. Mm-hmm. And so I think generally the batting averages are higher in private equity, but the average returns are somewhat lower. Mm-hmm. And now today, that field is so crowded and capital is so abundant that I think it's still it still can be a good business, but it's very competitive.
Mm-hmm. Now you're also quite the movie producer.
I would hardly say that.
I always go back to Brian Grazer's point that he's got this amazing track record. Splash, Beautiful Mind, Parenthood, very successful TV shows. He says he can't get his ideas funded 90% of the time. Is his broader point that he doesn't get to that this is an incredibly difficult business to call?
Well, let me just say at the outset, before I went to business school, I was working in New York and Washington, D.C. as a wannabe actor and director and things like that. So I had an interest in theater and film from my early 20s, but then when I went to business school, I said I focused on finance and investments, and that's pretty much what I did. And then when we merged Allied Capital with Ares Capital in 2010, there's a part of me that said, gee, I really wonder if I could have produced movies or done things like that. And it was a fascinating experience, and I'm glad I did it. But it's a very, very tough business. And, our movies, 2 of the 3 movies I was involved in, I think are quite good. One of them could have been better. I learned the difference between a final cut and not having final cut. And if you have final cut, you get last word on what the movie looks like. If you don't have it, somebody else does. And if their opinion isn't the right one, you can lose a lot of money. But yeah, I think movies are very difficult, particularly for independents, because movies are Hollywood's a very, very small shop, a very social shop, and there are guys and gals playing poker together on Tuesday night someplace in West Hollywood, and they get to know each other, and there's a very, very it's a small industry in that regard. And then the other side of it, though, is you go on to sets, or you go out afterwards and you're involved in this thing, and it's a lot of fun. They're great people. Everybody on the set loves doing it. They wouldn't be anyplace else. It's a great band of artist gypsies, and it's great fun to be part of it. And but let me go from an and to a but. The issue with movies is you're making a product. A single movie, a 90 to 120 minute product, and you get it, financed, you put it together, you produce it, you go into post-production, you get it distributed, and everything's really behind that one product, and there's no other next product. And so if it works, you've got some sort of upside in that one movie, but that's it. And I think you're seeing a lot of the creative talent and the financial people with financial acumen moving into TV, or they already have. And I think cable right now, the long form, the binge watching series on Netflix is really, I think, where most of the talent is. So I thoroughly enjoyed producing a movie. At least maybe I didn't enjoy it financially, but I enjoyed every other aspect of it. But I would argue people ought to think more of those long form series, which is, I think, where the future is today.
I once asked an actor, why don't you direct? And he said, you have no idea how difficult it is to be a director. I'll ask you this. What's your perception of the director having made movies?
Well, I agree with your friend. But it's not just the director. The director on the set is, it's unbelievably complex, because you've got sound, you've got the actors, you've got the cinematography, you've got the storytelling, you've got all of that. But my own experience is maybe an example of this. I put a small amount of money with some local film entrepreneurs. They made sci-fi and fantasy films, shorts. And, as you know from my background, I spent, decades running things, being in charge, and which I enjoy, but there's a certain point at which you really don't want to be in charge. And I'll never forget the moment when I was on the set of one of these little shorts, and I was playing the heavy. I was playing the bad guy, which was fun. And I was there, and I was watching this guy run around doing these things, and I was thinking, gee, I'm only glad I have to remember my lines.
Such difficult work.
Yeah, well, it's fun though. I mean, it's highly, it's worth the aggravation.
I love that point about how it's only knowing the lines, because that was the actor's point to me. He didn't say it quite that way, but he said that's a really. Now, kind of changing gears, I know you through the policy world. Obviously, you're a longtime benefactor for all sorts of organizations. And where I'd like to begin there is, what shaped your political views? How long have you been a believer in free enterprise and freedom in general?
I think I was not particularly political for most of my career, most of my life. I'm not all that active, but I think the thing that shaped my views was running a public company. And what I came to appreciate running a public company, and this would have been around, I think I started around 1997. And what I came to appreciate was the regulatory climate that a public company operates in, and not only the laws or the regs, but also the personal attitude towards business. And in the 80s, we had entrepreneurs who were pretty much lionized, and I think that was true. And we had Inc. magazine and Money magazine, and maybe it wasn't Money, but it was something along those lines. And the entrepreneur, the wealth creator, was a hero, and that remains my view. But I think with the public company world, and particularly with Enron and WorldCom, and I can't remember the third member of that group, Tyco, all blowing up because of fraud in the CEO suite in 1999? I'm dating.
Yeah, 2001.
I'm losing my years. Anyway, I think at that point, I saw public opinion sway hard and strong against free enterprise, and I saw a regulatory climate that was increasingly hostile to the market, and by that I mean regulatory climate. If you run a public company, there are things like Sarbanes-Oxley, there's Section 404, there's all these things you've got to do that are supposed to keep the company safer. In my view, don't really do that, but they detract from your ability to create businesses. And so I think that got me into thinking more about politics and which side I lined up on. And so I find myself more of a libertarian, although now I've come to view also not only the libertarian views, but I think also some of the social issues are vital to this country. I think we need strong families. I think we need respect for life, things like that. So I've evolved probably in the last 15, 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you bring up Sarbanes-Oxley, and maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like it's been forgotten. How damaging it was when it passed. That was back in 2002, and George W. Bush said this is the toughest anti-business crime law since FDR. Is this something that still weighs?
It did nothing to prevent 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing.
Mm-hmm. Is it something
those were generals fighting the last war,
as they always do?
Yeah.
I like to say that the people regulating the business, whatever sector, are those who couldn't get a job in that sector in the first place. So
that sounds true. I concur with that.
Is it something? I think it's unfortunate that no one's talking about it. What do you think the impact would be? Someone who's in the world, if we finally repealed it, would it be a noticeable impact for businesses, or have they gotten used to it?
Well, I think the big ones have gotten used to it because they can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
The thing to keep in mind is that in the public company world, there are half as many public companies now as there were 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is the regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley, where you're required to do all this extra accounting work, incur enormous cost burden, particularly in a small company. So if you're, 25 years ago, you might have thought about going public with $5 million in profit, but now Sarbanes-Oxley, some people estimate, would cut that profit in half. And so you don't want to go public because you're going to incur all these other costs and obligations. Mm-hmm. And so you take Sarbanes-Oxley, and then there are other rules that change. Like there used to be rules in investment banking where investment banks, or for investment bankings, were they could make, say, 5 cents on each trade of a stock. Well, then it made a lot of sense to be in that business because you could make a profit trading stock. And then they decided in their wisdom that was not good because the investment bankers are making too much money, so they created the so-called penny rule, where you couldn't make much money trading in small stocks, and so the number of people supporting the stock went away, the research coverage went away, research coverage went away, and so it's not just Sarbanes-Oxley, it's the whole trading environment. And then now with Dodd-Frank, the ability of upstart investment banks to get into the business is almost non-existent. Dodd-Frank, Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein will say, Dodd-Frank is great for us. It's created a regulatory moat around our business, using Warren Buffett's idea about a moat that keeps people out of your castle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that, but there are probably 7 or 8 things you'd want to unwind. But I don't see a real constituency for it right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thinking about this, and so being in the business world and seeing the different political policy actions that made life more difficult, if you could tell Paul Ryan, who would probably agree much more with you than the average person, if you could tell him one thing that he perhaps doesn't know, what would you like to tell him? What is he missing, policy-wise, that would have a big impact?
Oh, my. John, you promised easy questions.
Well,
I think Paul has a very big brain. He knows a lot. I don't know what he doesn't know. I think, let me rephrase that. What he could do right now is we could just get a good tax cut.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if we put all of our eggs in that basket and got a 15% rate on corporations, we'd see an investment boom in this country like we haven't seen since the good old days. Mm-hmm. And we could get our economic growth rate up from an anemic 1.5 or 2% to 3.5, 4%, maybe more, because you'd have lots of capital coming back into the United States that's been driven out by the high tax rates. You'd have a major incentive. They'd have all that much more capital to reinvest because they're paying less taxes. And I think Paul could do that.
Mm-hmm. What if it's Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer sitting in my seat? What would you like to tell them that they don't know? And again, this is not a bad thing. It's more, what would you like them to know that if they perhaps knew it, they might change their view of the world?
That economic growth is a good thing, and that they can do a lot to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And if the economy is growing robustly, they'll have a lot more money to play with because they're going to be collecting that much more tax revenues. And they ought to be thinking about the policies they've enacted or the things they blocked that slow economic growth. Mm-hmm. And I think I would also stop demonizing the wealth creators. I mean, I don't know Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer in particular, but you got Elizabeth Warren saying, you didn't build that to an entrepreneur. It's not exactly motivating.
I don't want to live in a world without Jeff Bezos, among many other great wealth creators.
Sure, yeah.
Now, thinking about all this, the media have created all sorts of perceptions of Donald Trump. They do this with any political figure. You obviously were a major part of his transition to the White House. What do people not know about him that they should? And what do you think might change their mind if they knew it?
Well, I think one thing they ought to know is he really does listen. I mean, he's not somebody that sits in a meeting and barks at people. He really does listen. He takes in a lot of information. And I think his ability to learn new things and act in them is evident in his entrepreneurial career. And I think he's showing some ability to learn in office. But I think I'm in a school where I think his tweets got him elected. Mm-hmm. They got him to go. He got his message out directly, but he also forces the media to cover him, and that's still true. But I just wish I could edit his tweets. Uh-huh. I mean, announcing LBGT policy in a series of 3 tweets is not the way you do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose the tweets got him elected, also made him do those other ones. So
yeah, your character is
you get the package.
Yeah, I mean it's a package. You can't take. You say, well, I like this piece of him, but I don't like this other piece of him. People aren't built that way.
Who's your favorite president of all time?
Calvin Coolidge.
Why? I agree.
Well, I think Calvin Coolidge had the view that things could run pretty well if people just tended to their own affairs, and he was a very articulate man. He was actually quite a good speechwriter, although he didn't give a lot of them. But he was very, very good at that, and he kept government in a place where it was supporting people and not intruding. And I think he would probably be he's in my pantheon.
Mm-hmm. if I made you dictator for a day, and I think I know one of the policies, what would be your top 3 policy changes that you think, if you could just do 3, that would have the biggest impact on economic growth specifically?
I think the biggest thing I do is not economic per se. It's if I were dictator, do I get the states as well as the federal?
You get it all.
I get it all.
Yeah, for a day.
I would bring about radical reform in education, and I think that's the biggest opportunity. I think we've got issues with people worrying about what happens with automation, and when trucks are driven by computers and not by people, that we're going to have people to employ. I think what the government-run schools and the teachers unions have done, in particular in inner cities, is just a tragedy. And I would free up the schools, and not just choice, but I would really break the lock of the unions. I'd break the lock of certification. I'd break the lock of accreditation, and I would open up education to people who could prove they could produce economic results, and not have a one-size-fits-all system. And people have this talent, they go to this kind of school, and you open it up to the market. Because I think education is definitely something that could be improved by competition and market forces, and there's very little of that now. And after that, my next 2, if I did that, I'd probably rest on my laurels, because the rest of it might take care of itself.
Are you optimistic?
Oh gosh, I'm optimistic for people. I'm sort of the opposite. There's this thing about the great intellectuals that they love mankind, but not people individually. I kind of like people. I'm optimistic about people I meet. I'm optimistic that we can make things happen. I love working in organizations where you can get together with people. My favorite word is getting together a work group where you work with people to make something happen. I'm very optimistic about people's ability to bring about solutions in their own lives. Where I get pessimistic is where I think we try to order something like re-regulating 1/5 of our economy, like healthcare, which is impossible. There's no human brain that can comprehend that. You get the smartest 100 people in healthcare in the world, and they still couldn't agree or figure out what a system is. We've ignored the individual solutions, the people closest to the problem being the problem solvers. And so I'd be optimistic to the extent we can make that happen. I mean, in a political world, that involves federalism. That means pushing more experimentation of all things and new things back to states. And so if Vermont can try one thing and Texas can try another, and we see what works best. And I think, and in business it's true, and in the military it's true. You very often delegate the decision making to the people closest to the problem. In Germany, for example, one of the reasons they think the German manufacturing machine works so well is the people on the lines in the factories are very close to just making decisions about how to use them and how to change them and how to do things. And where the model came from? It came from the military, where the sergeants in the German army were the ones often delegated the most power on the battlefield to make decisions. And Germany, most people don't know this, probably won World War I until the United States came in. And they did it because they were organized to be close to the action.
Well, it's an essential point. Business mistakes are borne by the businesses themselves. Federal mistakes are suffered by all of us. And so I think you're hitting on something really important in bringing this back, bringing most decision-making back local.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this. This was very educational for me. And
educational for me, too.
For the viewers, too. Thank you for this. Thank you for letting me sit sort of in your chair today.
Well, you're in my chair. That's okay. All right, John, thanks.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe to Common Ground with Bill Walton on iTunes.